What are the links between the UK civil service and Freemasonry, and are they problematic? The UK civil service, an impartial and non-political body, serves a crucial role in implementing government policy, ensuring public administration functions effectively across various departments. The civil service's core values, integrity, impartiality, honesty, and objectivity, are foundational principles intended to foster public trust and maintain fairness in the execution of government responsibilities. However, when civil servants maintain affiliations with external organizations, especially those that operate privately, questions can arise regarding their influence on public duties and transparency. One such organization that frequently appears in discussions around public service impartiality is Freemasonry, a fraternal organization with centuries-old traditions that emphasize brotherhood, moral uprightness, and charity. Founded formally in the early 18th century, Freemasonry has historically included prominent figures from various sectors of society, including public officials. Despite its philanthropic image, the organization has long been regarded by some as secretive and exclusive, creating an aura of mystery that has led to public suspicion. Freemasonry's influence, particularly within the civil service, has become a subject of debate, with some critics suggesting that its networks could undermine impartiality and public confidence in governmental processes. This essay examines the connections between the UK civil service and Freemasonry, delving into the perceived implications of such affiliations. Through a discussion of historical ties, current policies, and potential conflicts, the essay assesses whether Masonic membership among civil servants poses a problem, either in practical terms or through the perception of bias. Ultimately, it seeks to determine whether these connections threaten the core principles of the civil service and if further transparency or regulatory measures might be necessary to uphold public trust. Historical context of Freemasonry in the UK. Freemasonry, with roots tracing back to medieval stonemason guilds, formally emerged in 1717 when the first Grand Lodge was established in London. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had developed into a well-organized fraternal institution, offering membership to men across social classes who shared a commitment to moral principles, fraternity, and charity. Freemasonry's influence quickly spread across British society, and it soon attracted members from influential circles, including aristocrats, politicians, and civil servants. With its elaborate rituals, exclusive membership, and hierarchical structure, Freemasonry became a notable part of British social life, especially among those in leadership and administrative roles. Freemasonry's appeal to influential members of society created a perception of privilege and secrecy, which has been a point of controversy since its early days. By the 19th century, Freemasonry was often associated with high-level decision-making bodies and state functions, even though Masonic lodges are officially non-political and non-religious. The organization's confidential nature and closed meetings led to concerns about potential biases and influence among its members, particularly those in government or public roles. In the civil service, which began to professionalize in the mid-19th century with the Northcote Trevelyan reforms, impartiality became a central tenet, intended to ensure that public servants would act independently of personal affiliations or biases. As the civil service grew in responsibility and influence, the need for impartiality intensified. Yet, due to its status as a social institution for the elite, Freemasonry continued to attract civil servants, perpetuating the question of whether membership in such a society could compromise the objectivity required in public roles. Though the full extent of Masonic influence in the civil service remains unclear due to the private nature of membership, This perceived connection has fueled debates over the centuries regarding transparency, fairness, and the potential for Masonic influence within government operations. The civil service's emphasis on integrity and impartiality stands in contrast to Freemasonry's loyalty to its members, leading some critics to question whether allegiance to Masonic principles could interfere with a civil servant's commitment to public duty. Such concerns persist, especially since Freemasonry's closed structure can appear at odds with modern expectations of accountability and transparency in public service. This historical context thus frames the ongoing debate: to what extent does membership in Freemasonry among civil servants create conflicts of interest or undermine public trust in the civil service? The relationship between Freemasonry and the civil service. The relationship between Freemasonry and the UK civil service is one rooted in a complex blend of tradition, networking, and shared values. For many years, Freemasonry offered an appealing network for civil servants, providing a social and charitable outlet outside of their official duties. By joining Freemasonry, members could access a vast network of individuals from various professions, including other government officials, lawyers, and businessmen, creating valuable connections that could serve both personal and professional purposes. Freemasonry's emphasis on brotherhood and mutual support aligns with the concept of a close-knit, morally guided community, which may appeal to those within the civil service who seek to be part of a network dedicated to ethical and philanthropic goals. However, this connection has also led to scrutiny, particularly due to the potential implications of loyalty and allegiance among Masonic members. Freemasonry's structure includes commitments to confidentiality, solidarity, and mutual support among members, values that can be interpreted as potentially conflicting with the civil service's principles of impartiality and transparency. Allegiance to a fraternal order, critics argue, could lead to favoritism or biased decision-making, particularly in recruitment, promotions, and policymaking, where interpersonal connections might influence professional outcomes. Notably, the lack of transparency regarding Masonic membership in the civil service fuels such concerns. Masonic membership is typically private, and unless voluntarily disclosed, it remains hidden from public view. This secrecy has raised questions over whether Freemasonry's internal loyalties could influence public service in ways that are not fully understood or monitored. Some cases of perceived favoritism or conflicts of interest involving Masons in public positions have led to public debates and parliamentary inquiries, although there is limited concrete evidence proving systematic Masonic influence within the civil service. Furthermore, the values of Freemasonry and the civil service, while overlapping in areas such as respect, duty, and charity, diverge on critical points. Freemasonry's historical reliance on secrecy and exclusivity can clash with the civil service's modern-day emphasis on openness and equal opportunity. For instance, the idea of private oaths of loyalty among Masons can appear incompatible with the impartial and unbiased approach expected of civil servants who serve the broader public. This divergence raises the question of whether personal affiliations, such as Freemasonry, could potentially compromise a civil servant's ability to act solely in the public's best interest. Despite these concerns, the true extent of Freemasonry's influence within the civil service remains largely speculative. Freemasonry's strict prohibition against discussing religion or politics within lodges serves as a counter-argument to claims that members could unduly influence each other's official duties. Moreover, Masons argue that Freemasonry emphasizes ethical behavior and high moral standards, which align with the civil service's core values. The organization's supporters maintain that Freemasonry encourages a sense of duty, charity, and integrity, which can complement the responsibilities of civil servants rather than detract from them. Nonetheless, the perceived relationship between Freemasonry and the civil service has led to debates over whether mandatory disclosure of Masonic membership should be required. Critics argue that such transparency is necessary to ensure public confidence and prevent conflicts of interest, while supporters argue that forcing disclosure would infringe upon individual privacy and freedom of association. This debate underscores the balancing act between allowing civil servants to maintain private affiliations and safeguarding public trust in an impartial and unbiased civil service. Potential concerns and issues. The relationship between Freemasonry and the UK civil service has stirred public debate over several potential concerns. These include the risks to impartiality, transparency, and public perception that Masonic membership could undermine the principles of the civil service. This section examines each of these concerns in depth to assess whether links between the two institutions might lead to conflicts of interest, favoritism, or a lack of trust in public administration. 1. Impartiality and objectivity. One of the primary concerns surrounding Freemasonry in the civil service is the possibility of compromised impartiality. Civil servants are expected to perform their duties without personal bias, acting solely in the public interest. However, Freemasonry's emphasis on brotherhood and loyalty among members can raise questions about whether Masonic civil servants may feel compelled to favor fellow Masons, consciously or unconsciously, in their professional decisions. The bonds of fraternity within Freemasonry create a sense of obligation to support other members, which can potentially clash with the requirement for civil servants to act impartially and objectively. Instances of alleged favoritism linked to Masonic affiliations have occasionally surfaced in media and public discussions, although conclusive evidence is often lacking due to the organization's private nature. Critics argue that even the perception of favoritism can be damaging, as it erodes public confidence in the civil service's neutrality. For example, if a civil servant were seen promoting or favoring a fellow Mason in hiring or policy decisions, it could be interpreted as a breach of public trust. While the existence of such influence is difficult to quantify, the potential for conflicts of interest remains a significant area of concern, leading some to argue that civil servants should openly declare any Masonic affiliations to mitigate doubts over their impartiality. 2. Transparency and accountability. Transparency is essential in maintaining accountability within the civil service. Yet Freemasonry's private and exclusive nature has led to criticism that Masonic membership among civil servants could undermine these values. Freemasonry does not require members to publicly disclose their affiliation, and as such, many civil servants' Masonic memberships remain unknown. This lack of disclosure fuels public suspicion that Masonic networks may operate in secrecy within government institutions, allowing members to assist each other or exert undue influence without accountability. The issue of transparency has been addressed by various government inquiries, most notably the 1997 Home Affairs Select Committee, which investigated the influence of Freemasonry in public institutions, including the police and judiciary. The committee recommended that all public officials, including civil servants, declare Masonic membership to ensure transparency. However, the recommendation was not universally implemented, and disclosure remains voluntary. Advocates for transparency argue that mandatory disclosure would help ensure that civil servants' actions are subject to public scrutiny, reinforcing accountability and dispelling doubts about potential conflicts of interest. Opponents of mandatory disclosure, however, argue that it could infringe upon the personal freedoms of civil servants. Membership in a private organization, they argue, should not be subject to public disclosure unless there is clear evidence that such membership influences official duties. This perspective highlights the challenge of balancing transparency with individual privacy, particularly when there is no proven evidence that Masonic membership leads to undue influence. Nonetheless, the debate over transparency continues, with some maintaining that public confidence in the civil service would benefit from greater openness. 3. Perceptions of elite networking and influence. Another concern surrounding the link between Freemasonry and the civil service is the perception of elite networking and preferential treatment within government. Freemasonry has long been viewed as an exclusive society, often associated with powerful individuals in influential positions. This perception can create an image of a hidden elite within the civil service, where members potentially wield influence through informal networks that the general public cannot access. For some, this perception alone is problematic, as it suggests that not all citizens have equal access to opportunities within government, raising concerns about fairness and equality. Studies on public opinion have shown that secretive or exclusive organizations, especially those involving individuals in positions of power, often generate mistrust among citizens. For example, surveys conducted by opinion research firms indicate that many people view Freemasonry as an old boys club and believe that Masonic members within government are likely to favor one another. This perception is particularly damaging to the civil service, which must be viewed as an impartial and accessible institution serving all citizens fairly. The public perception of Freemasonry as a networking tool for elites can be further fueled by the rituals and symbols that reinforce its mystique. Civil servants who are members of such an organization may thus be perceived as part of an exclusive network that operates outside the boundaries of formal accountability. This suspicion undermines the civil service's credibility, especially among communities that already feel marginalized by government institutions. The civil service's commitment to equality of opportunity and fairness risks being undermined by associations with a group perceived as privileged and exclusive. Government and civil service regulations on Masonic membership. In response to concerns over potential conflicts of interest, transparency, and impartiality, the UK government has periodically reviewed policies concerning Masonic membership among civil servants. While there is no current requirement for civil servants to declare Freemasonry membership, historical inquiries and discussions have repeatedly addressed the issue, reflecting broader concerns about public trust in the civil service. One of the most significant investigations into Masonic influence within public institutions was led by the Home Affairs Select Committee in 1997. This inquiry examined the role of Freemasonry within the police, judiciary, and other public bodies, including the civil service. The committee found that the secrecy associated with Freemasonry could be detrimental to public trust, particularly in institutions where impartiality and fairness are essential. To address these concerns, the committee recommended that all public officials, including civil servants, should declare Masonic membership as part of a transparency initiative. This recommendation aimed to ensure accountability and to reassure the public that civil servants were acting without undue influence. Despite the committee's recommendations, the UK government did not adopt mandatory disclosure policies for Freemasonry membership among civil servants. Instead, disclosure remains voluntary, and many Masonic members choose not to reveal their affiliation. Government guidelines on external affiliations emphasize that civil servants should avoid conflicts of interest and ensure that personal affiliations do not influence their professional responsibilities. However, Freemasonry is not singled out as requiring mandatory disclosure, reflecting a view that such private associations should be a matter of personal choice unless they demonstrably interfere with official duties. The debate over mandatory disclosure continues, with advocates arguing that transparency is essential to maintaining public confidence in the civil service. Proponents of disclosure believe that knowing whether a civil servant is a Freemason would prevent suspicions of favoritism and reinforce public trust. However, opponents argue that requiring Masonic members to disclose their affiliations would infringe upon individual privacy and could lead to discrimination, especially since there is no concrete evidence linking Masonic membership with biased behavior in official roles. Currently, the Civil Service Code requires civil servants to uphold principles of integrity, impartiality, and objectivity. Any affiliations, including Freemasonry, are expected to be managed in a way that does not conflict with these principles. The government's stance suggests that as long as civil servants adhere to the code of conduct, their personal associations should remain a private matter. Nonetheless, the lack of a disclosure requirement leaves room for public speculation and, potentially, mistrust, as the question of whether Masonic affiliations could influence public duties remains open. The regulatory approach taken by the civil service reflects a balancing act between maintaining public trust and respecting individual privacy. This approach allows civil servants the freedom to participate in private organizations, including Freemasonry, while holding them accountable for any actions that could compromise their impartiality or integrity. However, the absence of mandatory disclosure policies means that the onus is on individual civil servants to manage any potential conflicts of interest, a policy that some argue may not go far enough to guarantee transparency. Arguments for and against the requirement of disclosure. The debate over whether civil servants should be required to disclose Freemasonry membership revolves around issues of transparency, privacy, and the potential impact of perceived conflicts of interest. Supporters of mandatory disclosure argue that it could enhance public trust and reduce suspicions of undue influence, while opponents contend that it infringes on individual freedoms and privacy. This section examines the key arguments on both sides. Arguments for disclosure. Enhanced transparency and public trust. Advocates for mandatory disclosure of Freemasonry membership among civil servants argue that transparency is essential to sustaining public confidence in the civil service. Freemasonry's private nature and the close bonds among its members can create suspicions of favoritism, even in the absence of any proven influence. By requiring disclosure, the civil service could preemptively address these concerns, reassuring the public that civil servants' decisions are based solely on merit and not influenced by personal affiliations. Mitigation of potential conflicts of interest. Proponents argue that mandatory disclosure could help prevent conflicts of interest before they arise. For instance, if a Masonic civil servant were involved in hiring or contract decisions involving fellow Masons, this could raise questions about impartiality. A disclosure requirement would allow supervisors and colleagues to assess such situations openly, ensuring that any decision-making is as transparent as possible and mitigating risks of perceived bias. Alignment with other transparency measures. Supporters often point out that public officials are typically required to disclose other affiliations or interests that may affect their impartiality, such as business interests, charity trusteeships, or family ties within the organization. Masonic membership, with its potential to foster loyalty and exclusivity, could similarly warrant disclosure. By aligning Freemasonry with these existing measures, the civil service could reinforce its commitment to transparency and impartiality, showing that it treats all potential influences equally. Arguments against mandatory disclosure. protection of individual privacy and freedom of association. Opponents of mandatory disclosure argue that requiring civil servants to reveal their Masonic affiliations infringes upon their right to privacy and freedom of association. Freemasonry is, at its core, a private organization, and civil servants are entitled to engage in private associations as long as they do not interfere with their professional responsibilities. Requiring disclosure could be viewed as a form of discrimination, singling out one organization for scrutiny without conclusive evidence of wrongdoing. Lack of evidence for systematic influence. Critics of mandatory disclosure also argue that there is no concrete evidence to suggest that Masonic membership among civil servants leads to biased or compromised behavior. Previous government inquiries, including the 1997 Home Affairs Select Committee investigation, did not uncover systematic abuses of power tied to Freemasonry. Without clear evidence that Masonic affiliations influence official duties, a mandatory disclosure policy could be seen as unnecessary and based more on public suspicion than on proven risks. Focus on conduct rather than private associations. Another argument against mandatory disclosure is that civil servants should be judged by their conduct, not by their private associations. The Civil Service Code outlines specific standards for impartiality, integrity, and honesty, which all civil servants are expected to follow. Proponents of this view argue that as long as civil servants uphold these standards, their private memberships should be irrelevant. They assert that the real issue is whether an individual's conduct aligns with public service values, not their personal affiliations outside of work. Risk of stigmatization and discrimination. Requiring disclosure of Masonic membership could inadvertently stigmatize Masons within the civil service, fostering an environment of discrimination and bias. Civil servants who are Masons might face unwarranted scrutiny or suspicion based solely on their affiliation, even if it has no bearing on their professional behavior. This could create an environment where Masonic civil servants feel pressured or unfairly judged, potentially impacting workplace morale and creating an atmosphere of distrust. Summary of arguments. The arguments for and against mandatory disclosure reveal a tension between public trust and individual rights. Proponents of disclosure emphasize that transparency would reinforce confidence in the civil service, aligning it with public expectations of accountability. Opponents, however, argue that privacy, freedom of association, and the lack of concrete evidence of Masonic influence all make such a measure excessive and potentially discriminatory. Ultimately, this debate reflects the broader challenge of balancing transparency with respect for personal freedoms in a way that maintains public trust while protecting individual rights. Conclusion. The relationship between the UK civil service and Freemasonry is complex and nuanced, shaped by historical associations, ethical debates, and contrasting views on transparency and privacy. The impartiality and objectivity of the civil service are essential to maintaining public confidence, and any personal affiliations that could appear to influence civil servants' actions are naturally subject to scrutiny. Freemasonry, with its long-standing traditions of fraternity and confidentiality, has drawn particular attention due to the potential for perceived conflicts of interest and concerns over secrecy. Through historical context, regulatory policies, and arguments on both sides of the debate, it is clear that the question of Masonic influence in the civil service is as much about public perception as it is about demonstrable effect. Critics argue that Masonic membership could undermine impartiality and transparency, potentially fostering favoritism or creating suspicion among the public. They assert that mandatory disclosure would provide greater transparency, dispelling doubts and reinforcing accountability within the civil service. On the other hand, Opponents of mandatory disclosure stress that without clear evidence of Masonic influence on civil service decisions, such a requirement would infringe upon civil servants' privacy and freedom of association. They argue that holding civil servants accountable for their conduct, rather than private affiliations, is a fairer approach, and that mandatory disclosure could unfairly stigmatize Masonic members without substantial cause. In assessing whether Masonic links within the civil service are problematic, it is essential to recognize both the potential for public mistrust and the importance of protecting individual rights. Currently, there is no evidence of systemic influence of Freemasonry within the civil service. As a result, concerns about Masonic membership may be more perceptual than factual. However, in an age where transparency and accountability are increasingly demanded by the public, the civil service could consider clearer guidelines or voluntary disclosure options that would allow Masonic members to assure the public of their impartiality without compromising their privacy. Ultimately, the issue may best be approached by focusing on robust adherence to the Civil Service Code, ensuring that all civil servants, regardless of personal affiliations, uphold principles of integrity, impartiality, and honesty. Such an approach allows for both transparency and respect for individual rights, balancing the need for public trust with fair treatment of civil servants. While Freemasonry remains a controversial topic, the commitment of the civil service to its core values can act as a safeguard against undue influence, maintaining confidence in its impartiality.